Kira, I'm going to begin with you. Let's talk about the phone call. Vladimir Putin, there's a readout from his side of things. There's also a Truth Social post from Donald Trump about what happened on the call. Give it to us.
Yeah, Katie, it's understandable that you're reading some things twice because we're getting two readouts from both sides in this very fast, from the Trump administration and also from the Kremlin. That in and of itself tells you something. There are dueling narratives about what's happened here, and both sides think it's important to get their version out. Let's start with President Trump's version. I think the headline here, just reading what President Trump has said, and I'll read a little bit to you in a moment, is that President Trump is backing away from what he said he wanted, which was a face-to-face meeting with President Putin. He also appears to be effectively accepting what President Putin has been saying he wants, which is to negotiate directly with the Ukrainians and to be left to do that, if you like, to kind of battle it out across the deal-making table. And finally, I think from reading what President Trump has said on his Truth Social platform, he does appear to be saying that normalization with Russia, read for that, economic deals, can only happen after there is a ceasefire, after there is an end to the war. So that's interesting. I'll just read you a little bit. I just completed a 2-hour call with President Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know details of a negotiation that nobody else will be aware of. He goes on to talk about the idea that trade, large-scale trade, would be possible if there was a ceasefire, and says there are places where that negotiation can happen. The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. We are at the same time, Katie, getting a readout from the Kremlin itself, from President Putin himself, who pretty much walked out of the call and stood in front of Russian state media and talked about what happened. And that's fairly unusual. And that tells you how important the president of Russia thinks it is to say what he thinks happened. He says in his words, and his words came first, after the call, that it was 2 hours. So both presidents appear to agree on that. He says it was informative and very open. Read from that he's trying to heap some praise on President Trump, say that President Trump is a good guy, if you like. And overall, my opinion, this is President Putin speaking, very useful. He says that he thanked the President Trump for bringing back direct negotiations after they had failed in 2022. Now, what Putin says in his interview, in his words, is that they failed because of Ukraine. That's not actually true. 3 years ago, those direct talks failed because the Russians had such impossible demands. So what it tells you is that President Putin on the call was still insisting on his version of events while he was talking to President Trump. And he does talk about compromise later in his statement, but he also talks about that Russia is still committed to what he says is the basic principles, which are, and he says it again in his statement after that call, the root causes, as he puts it, of this 3-year war. When President Putin talks about root causes, what he means is that he wants Ukraine to be almost entirely neutral. It can't join NATO. That it wants Ukraine to hand over more territory than the Russians actually hold at this stage, and a number of other demands which Ukrainians will not sign up to. So here's the point. It doesn't look as if President Trump is now going to be hosting these talks or leading these talks. It looks like he wants the Ukrainians and the Russians to do it. And already the leader of Russia, President Putin, is making clear that he is going to stick to his demands.
Yeah, Julie, am I wrong? Listen, it's early. We're going to find out more about this call. But am I wrong to read into this as Donald Trump backing away from it, washing his hands of the negotiations? I mean, he kept saying on day one that he would end it. It's day 114 or something. It's still going. And by saying the Vatican wants to host this, they're going to handle it, is this him saying, I'm no longer a part of these negotiations, let them hash it out?
Yeah, it seemed while trying to save face, right? So he's kind of acknowledging that these are going to be negotiations about negotiations about negotiations, and everyone else is best positioned to do this other than me, and so let them have at it. I think it's interesting also, lead up to today's call, you had people like Margarita Simonyan, who is the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, RT, a 100% Kremlin-funded operation. She is one of Putin's favorite propagandists, and she was trolling J.D. Vance on Twitter in English. That video that you saw from Air Force Two, where he's saying there's all this trade that could happen, and we want to know if Vladimir Putin is serious, and that's what Donald Trump is going to say to him. You know, are you serious about these negotiations? And she basically said, you know, JD, we thought you were a serious person. How can you not? Oh, because he said, we don't know if Vladimir Putin knows the way out of this war, if he knows how to get out of this war. And she said, yeah, he obviously knows how to get out of this war, meaning press it till the very end, till he conquers all of Ukraine. And I think that's kind of, and I wonder if the Trump administration understands this, that when Vladimir Putin talks about root causes, what he's talking about is by hook or by crook, we want what we want, which is all of Ukraine subjugated and malleable to our wishes and our demands. And either we can get that the peaceful way through peace negotiations, or we'll get it by war. Those negotiations that happened in Istanbul last week, if you recall, Russia's representatives came out of there and said, we're willing to fight forever. We fought Sweden for 21 years. We'll do that again here. That's not a party that wants to make peace. And maybe the president heard that today, but I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back around and says, well, you know, I think my buddy Putin is willing to negotiate, and we're going to talk because there are all these business opportunities.
Yeah, and I'd be very curious to see what Volodymyr Zelensky's reaction to the initial readouts of this call, or maybe the more detailed readout, whether there's going to be a negotiation that's starting soon, if they're actually going to meet together, if Vladimir Putin will sit down face to face with Volodymyr Zelensky. I know there were negotiations in Turkey last week. Vladimir Zelensky was there. Vladimir Putin never showed up. Vladimir, what is your sense of this the initial details that we have of this call?
Well, for once in my life, I actually agree with Vladimir Putin that this war is going to go on for as long as the root causes are not resolved. Of course, the real root cause is a Soviet KGB officer who's openly nostalgic for the days of Stalin and Andropov, who's called the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Empire, called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, who has brought back so many Soviet-era practices in Russia, both in terms of the horrendous internal repression. We have now a record number of political prisoners in the whole of our post-Soviet history. And of course, external aggression with his incursions into Georgia, into Ukraine, the intervention in Syria on the side of Assad, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that is now well into its fourth year. As long as that root cause is not resolved, yes, there will be war on European soil. For as long as there's a regime in the Kremlin, an undemocratic, authoritarian, repressive, belligerent, and archaic regime that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people, that disregards its own laws and its own constitution, it will always disregard the norms of international law and the civilized ways of international behavior. And so for as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, for as long as he remains in the Kremlin, there will be war not just in Ukraine, but in Europe as a whole. The only way to achieve long-term peace, stability, and security, not only for Ukraine, but for the European continent as a whole, is to have a normal democratic political system in Russia. But there was one very important outcome of these talks in Istanbul that took place last Friday. And I want to talk about something positive because it's not often that we get to do that. I mean, of course, the deal, a swap, a prisoner swap, 1,000 for 1,000, the largest scale prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine since the start of the full-scale war. Hopefully, we're going to see it happen in the next few days. And that, as you know, Katie, is an enormous problem. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands, not only POWs, but also Ukrainian civilian hostages who are held on Russian or Russian-occupied territory, abducted Ukrainian children. As I mentioned, a record number of Russian political prisoners, and the single biggest reason for their imprisonment is because they are speaking out against the war. You know, when I was in prison in Siberia, my neighbors in a maximum security wing of that prison in other solitary confinement cells were Ukrainian officers, some from the Azov regiment, there was a colonel from the Ukrainian military intelligence, and so on. And so this is actually the first good news, if we can say so, in terms of this process in a long, long time. I hope this swap happens. I hope it's not the last one. And I also hope that going forward, we will see not only Ukrainian prisoners of war be released from Russian captivity, but also civilian hostages, abducted children who need to be returned home, and Russian political prisoners, because for so many of them, it is not only a question of unlawful and unjust imprisonment, it is actually a question of life or death, as it is for Alexei Gorinov, the Moscow municipal councillor who was the first person arrested because of his public opposition to the war in Ukraine. He's currently being transferred to Siberia on prisoner transport. He has just been diagnosed with tuberculosis, which for his condition, he's already missing a part of his lung. He's well into his 60s. He may not survive for long. And so it is absolutely essential and it is absolutely imperative that whatever else happens in these ceasefire negotiations, in these talks over some kind of a deal, that people's lives are prioritized, because we're not hearing enough of this. We're hearing about sanctions and territories and frozen assets. We hear about rare earth minerals, but we're not talking enough about human beings. There's nothing we can do to bring back the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost because of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. But it is still possible to save the tens of thousands of lives of the captives of this war, both Ukrainians and Russian, and that issue must be an absolute priority.